Welcome, everybody. I'm Scott Marble. I'm the chair of the School of Architecture, and I'm excited about the event we have planned today for everybody. It's an event that was organized by our very own John Peponis. It's a kind of book launch in some ways, and kind of a celebration of the work that's assembled in the book that John and his co-speakers are going to talk about, called 21BB Model Region Berlin-Brandenburg, Analyses and Visions for the 21st Century. And this is edited by Wilfried Wang, one of the speakers, and his partner, Barbara Hoyden, with essays by John, by Paul Rogers and Wilfried and others. And the book also includes a submission that they worked on to an international design competition focused on the long-term development of the Brandenburg area in Berlin. And I was fortunate to get an early version of the book from John a couple of months ago now. And it's a gorgeous book. It's an incredible book, and I encourage everybody to get a copy of it. I think it is available or will be very soon. So I'm just here to kind of introduce John and let him introduce the speakers. John doesn't really need an introduction to this audience, but I do just want to say on a personal note that John has been an invaluable mentor to me really since I arrived at the school, and has had a huge impact on our school over his 30+ years here as a teacher, a scholar, researcher, administrator. And his impact really can't be overstated. So join me in welcoming John, and then John will introduce the other two speakers.
Thank you so much, Scott. That's a very nice thing to hear you say. Okay, I want to first give a sense of how this whole thing started. Wilfried, who I will introduce in a moment, called around the fall of 2019 and told me that Berlin was about to celebrate 100 years since it started its own larger Berlin Planning Authority, and this celebration would be in the year 2020, and there would be a competition in order to initiate a new discussion about the future of the city in the light of contemporary issues. And initially there was a hope that maybe this competition would be run by the planning authority itself. In the end, it was run by the Association of Architects and Engineers of Berlin, and it was an international ideas competition. In order to take part in that competition, Wilfried created a team. Of course, Barbara Hoyden and himself were the leaders of the effort, but Bureau Happold joined in through Paul Rogers, but also other members of Paul's team. And then there was Tilman Latz, a landscape architect, and others. And as part of that team, we at Georgia Tech collaborated with colleagues at the Chalmers University of Technology and with one of our recent graduates who was at the time working as a postdoc at the University of Texas, Austin, and played some part in this larger effort. And what was so exciting about this is that Wilfried always saw this effort as an exercise in trying to bring up the level of conversation in Berlin in various ways, including the suggestion that debates about policy and design can be supported by hard facts and by, why not use the word, by science. So that was the background that led to a book that I want to briefly show if I successfully share my screen. And the book that Scott already mentioned, you can see it, I hope. It's actually an exciting book because it's in 4 parts. There is a first part which is basically a number of essays by various contributing authors. They include Richard Burdett, Rosanna Montiel, and others. Then there is a part which is basically an atlas of Berlin that Wilf and Barbara had put together to inform their own project. Then there is a quite substantive part of student projects at the University of Texas at Austin that Wilfried has supervised over a number of years. And at the end, the final part is a presentation of the competition entry. Since the book was produced, that same competition entry has been presented in exhibitions at the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, and also I'm sure I will mispronounce it, Kronprinzenpalais, also in Berlin. And so today's discussion is really a part of this series of conversations that are aimed at raising the issue of the metropolis of the future. And I'd like to introduce the speakers. Paul Rogers has joined Bureau Happold in 1986 and became a partner in the year 2000. And in the last several years, has been their senior partner. And this is a position that he says that he will give over to someone else in the near future. He is an engineer, and indeed a structural engineer by training. And he went to Berlin in 1994 and has been fascinated by the physical infrastructure integration when the city came together after the events in '89. But in recent years, Paul has led a group of his colleagues that they think of themselves as the cities group, and they have been approaching this district scale themes such as urban planning, energy, mobility, economics, and waste logistics. And so it's a great pleasure that we will have Paul start the panel presentations this afternoon. Wilfried is the O'Neill Ford Centennial Chair in Architecture at the University of Texas at Austin, where he went in the year 2000, about the same time as he started his practice with Barbara Hoyden in Berlin. Previously, Wilf taught in a number of places, including the Bartlett, the GSD, and ETH, among others. And he's held a number of roles in addition to practice and academia, including being the director of the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt between 1995 and 2000. He's authored multiple monographs on architects like Adolf Loos, Eileen Gray, Lou Erdens, and Hans Sarun, among others, and has also curated exhibitions. Very recently, a full-scale installation of Eileen Gray's master bedroom in her house, E1027. One thing I admire in particular is the collection of monographs and duographs he produces almost annually through the O'Neill Ford chair, the O'Neill Ford monographs and duographs. And of course, in the old days when he was even younger than he is now, he was one of the founding editors of a initially student magazine that left quite the track, 9H. So with that, I will ask Paul to start the panel presentations.
Thank you, John. I hope you can hear me and see me shortly. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
And hear you very well.
And I should be sharing my screen any second now.
We can see your screen.
You can see my screen. Wonderful. So thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to take a few minutes to talk about our work together on Berlin-Brandenburg 2070. And if I have time, just John asked if I could provide some insight maybe into a couple of projects we're doing elsewhere across Bureau Happold. Very briefly, Bureau Happold was founded in 1976, currently 1,900 employees across 24 offices. We work across different scales. As John said, I am actually a structural engineer by training, so I've been working historically in building engineering design, but we're doing more and more work in city planning and urban scale, in regional and district scale. And tonight we're talking more about our district and cities type work. I would say that it's, delighted to be speaking to an audience perhaps largely made up of students, but I can't imagine there's been a more exciting time to be training and be considering a future career in a city and district scale planning. Some of the themes that we're having to deal with today and understand, and some of the transitionary trends going across this sector. We know housing is in short demand, good quality and affordable housing. In Germany, we have a Dieselgate, but there's a mobility transition, electrification of mobility, and moving away from private mobility forms to public shared forms. There's an energy transition away from fossil and nuclear fuels to renewables. All of that is linked by technology and smart technology, digitization agenda. And probably the biggest challenge of all, we have a climate emergency, and our skills are needed in responding to that. And I'll come back to that later because that is a core part of our competition response. Just to give a little bit of context into Berlin-Brandenburg 2070, Berlin is a city of about 3.6, 3.7 million people. Brandenburg is about 2.5 million people. I don't suppose from a population density either of these regions or cities are particularly high in the scale in their equivalents around the globe. Just to give a scale of, or an idea of scale of the size of Brandenburg, if you drove north to south, I guess it would take about 3 hours. If you drove east to west, it would take probably 2 hours. In preparing for the competition, we did a little bit of context work, and these few slides here just help to show some of the tools that we also work in. This is in GIS. There are a lot of open source data sources in which you can collect data. So we were looking at a number of themes in here. We were looking at social justice, living conditions, things like hospitals, universities, colleges, education, etc. And of course, you start to see around Berlin, there's quite good provision. Other parts of Brandenburg in the early 90s, there was a de-densification as the post-unification. Therefore, these areas are slightly below average in their service levels. Not that we're trying to turn the whole of this diagram green. On the contrary, there's a cost of providing infrastructure services and social services, and therefore, we're still building context. Moving on to mobility and urban connectivity, you can start to see the network of urban centers around Berlin. I don't want to call them secondary or satellite centers. I think they're an important part of the structure that we're looking to develop. They're quite well distributed, and if you analyze the current connectivity, it's actually not bad, and you start to see some of the areas, whether through street networks or rail networks, we need to start interfilling to create a better pattern and a more resilient pattern. Going on to food, ecosystem, agriculture, there's a lot of land in Berlin, there's a lot of protected area, there's a lot of agricultural land. There's actually quite a lot of water, and it's very interesting the last few summers. Nevertheless, there's been talk of a slight challenge in terms of water supply, and that's not just within Brandenburg, that's across region and actually across border regions slowly. So you start to see the scale of some of the issues we're working with. And finally, energy, renewable energy is becoming part of the landscape of Brandenburg. There's been some quite significant investments, but there still needs to be much more, and significant investments in distribution networks to move energy around the country, and above all, to store it. And I'll touch upon that theme a little bit later. So that's just a little bit of context in terms of Brandenburg. So just moving to the competition and where we started. The competition Berlin-Brandenburg 2070, demands consideration of a future strategic plan for our region. It's 50 years from now. That's quite a long time. United Nations, European Union goals require or mandate that we're carbon neutral in terms of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Therefore, we really are fighting a climate emergency now. Therefore, an integrated, holistic response to sustainable and carbon mitigation, I would say, is absolutely at the core of our thinking and of our proposition. Question, therefore, in the context of a regional plan, how do we holistically interpret sustainability and a carbon neutral response? And we selected for this competition, we chose to consider the efficient, smart, sensible use of resource. And by resource, we meant material resource such as energy, water, agricultural land, natural resource in the natural landscape, and immaterial resources like considering governance, research and education, culture and experience. And if you then start to place these resources into a structure that you can work at different levels, you consider resource on a national, regional, city level, you can then start to overlay resource flows. And in the last 30 to 40 years, there's been a trend to globalization. This is schematically represented here and deliberately overstated. Although, in my opinion, Berlin-Brandenburg had a reasonably good balance of resource. But the reality is we're drawing resources from across the globe. There are also secondary and tertiary resource flows. And probably unintentionally, we've created a degree of chaos in terms of resource use with unintended consequences. Therefore, we would argue that you need a more strategic rethink in terms of how we treat and deal with all resources. And therefore, we believe there's an alternative approach, as shown here, building initially on regional resources, with economic investment to promote sensible regional industries serving regional needs. And then you can build on a national and continental scale. And finally, where it's only explicitly desired, or appropriate, you actually fall back into global resource networks. We're definitely not saying that Berlin-Brandenburg should develop an introverted perspective, but we are saying we should build a stronger respect for the value and the use of resources. But how will this theoretical image manifest itself in reality? How will these themes be integrated into urban solutions where their effect will be multiplied? And what I mean is, how will every resource, that could be economic, urban, or infrastructure, be integrated into a continuum that comprises of numerous individual components, but where the sum of the parts has a far greater effect in value? Therefore, those responsible for our cities, districts, and regions need to plan and build on a consequential basis so that every individual investment works for itself, but has enhanced value as part of an integrated economic framework. Let me just explain that by looking at a couple of examples. And one of them would be the use of natural timber, a resource that actually in Europe is experiencing a renaissance. Brandenburg is a source of natural timber resource that can be sponsored within targeted investment into strong commercial new timber and forestry industries. Therefore, we have a source of low carbon building material compared to the carbon intensive mainstream alternatives of reinforced concrete and steel. That in turn supports and develops a timber industry, new businesses that can be located in the evolving urban centres that we're foreseeing within this competition. And therefore, we're developing locally a low carbon industry producing building components that will support the urban environment, ideally suited to the urban model that Wilfried will come on and talk about. Let me give you a second example in the one of energy. We currently have an energy mix in Germany based on fossil fuels and a mix of renewables, such as wind and photovoltaic. In the future, town and city administrations will be the local energy providers in Germany. Stadtwerke really already are. But there'll be a real need for greater investment in renewable infrastructure that's going to be needed. This will become a recognizable part of our landscape, and as I say, will be owned by the cities that invest into these technologies. Renewables will electrify our urban centres as well as our mobility, and hydrogen will store that clean energy for times when we have no wind or sun. And every town will work equally well off-grid, whilst working, networked between towns in a sort of a smart grid, technologically driven environment. But every district and every town needs to seriously invest in the appropriate infrastructure to build scale that will be recognisable and provide our needs in the future. The final example of this would be mobility. As noted just a minute ago, mobility will be electrified through renewables and the use of hydrogen. But then we need to invest in a significant upscaling of associated infrastructure and the related, private and public mobility systems that, we'll need for the future. This in itself will promote research and investment in new technologies and technological networks. And these will be based in smart campus type environments, and I'm sure Wilfried might talk about that. Again, the typology of regional urban development that we are predicting within this competition. Finally, it's just worth noting, particularly with a connection back to the US, Tesla, not very long ago, 15 months ago, we interviewed for this project, committed to a gigafactory in Berlin. It's 2/3 finished remarkably. But why were they attracted to this region? And they were attracted to this region because it's committed to renewable energies. The region is committed to future-orientated firms that, commit to these sort of economic cycles. We call it the Energiewende in Germany. They know there's an educated working community, able to work at national and international level. But they're only going to want to be here if we provide a quality urban environment that's affordable. That comes back to that urban quality again that competition is looking to promote. John did ask me to just include some other examples of other things Bureau Happold are going on, and I know we're up against time, so I'll be as quick as I can. But I'd just like to talk about two projects, one in Saudi Arabia and one in the US. And as a practice, we've worked in Saudi Arabia continuously for 45 years, and personally I spent 3 years there at the end of the 80s. In recent years, there's been a rapid change, and there are many eye-catching examples of projects that get plenty of attention. And as a firm, we're working on many of them, I must admit. But Saudi is a G20 country, and in reality, it's a middle-income country. But nevertheless, there is a high degree of inequality across society. And although it's considered a country of high wealth, there is actually a high portion of poverty, both in the native population and within the migrant communities. In part, this is recognizable in the informal or low-quality settlements that have evolved over many years. They've received little investment and strategic foresight. And we've been involved in a number of strategic plans in both Jeddah and Riyadh that consider improvement through enhancement in economic consideration into urban planning. These have been involved in prioritizing, budget adjustment frameworks from ministries top down, measuring inequalities and establishing plans to reallocate funds into local projects. In part, redirecting investment from the hard infrastructure, such as roads and flyovers, to more localized community projects in terms of district and community enhancements. And these are just some, examples of images. Often, as in this case with these examples, they're often an environmental response. So here is a wadi environment. We're doing flood alleviation, pollution eradication, and really they're an environmental enhancement strategies that are creating social districts that are often the poorer districts that are suffering from these issues, but creating places where people want to live, want points of leisure, and therefore, creating some economic and good quality urban environment. Just very briefly to finish, an example to the States. And some years ago, we were involved in the Detroit Future Cities program, sometime around 2012-13. Detroit has suffered or experienced over an extended period of time significant population or depopulation change, economic change from manufacturing to more high-end services. Therefore, the city that's historically designed for a significant population around the 1950s, and city infrastructure systems therefore were aligned, to this population size and quite rigid and quite centralized. So in the context of running these cities, systems is proportionally high and inefficient. And effectively, the city had to consider a selective de-densification, effectively leaving underperforming districts and transform the areas of their city into public space or alternative use. And in doing so, starting to de-densify other parts of the cities. And here you can see some of the transitioning plans. But what's quite interesting around that, if I just jump 2 slides, you can start to draw this S-shaped curve. And what we found actually in Detroit, and actually we could have brought this had we had more time and resource into competition in Berlin-Brandenburg, but actually what was working in this city was a compact, mid-rise, medium density solution. And what's interesting about that is the cost to serve level of infrastructure is actually quite low, particularly in comparison to that suburban, dare I say, sprawl, low density solution where the cost is very high. And if you start to overlay, the 15-minute city philosophy onto those, more compact urban centres, you start to get an urban model and an affordability around providing infrastructure to serve that model. And I think I can just follow these slides. And my last slide really is quite interesting. 10 years down the road, you now see a lot of private development, and we're actually involved in 3 or 4 projects at a building scale in Detroit. So you see how the urban planning component leads into the building development in a cyclic form as well. But I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing and I'll pass on to Wilfried, who will pick up from that point.
Thank you, Paul.
If I turn off my...
Thank you, Paul. So the jump from the large-scale view of Brandenburg and the impact on Berlin is obviously quite significant. And what I would like to do is to begin with the key argument that the team confronted, which is what are the essential components that lead us to certain decisions. Together with John and his colleagues from Chalmers University, Meta Berghauser-Pont and Lars Marcus, and Chen Fang, who worked with us at UT, we considered not only the regional economic and energy issues, as Paul has already outlined, but how some of those larger frameworks of equity and interconnectivity and mobility finally translate into physical urban form. And so let me talk about 2 issues right at the beginning that gives you a background to our approach. Why density and why sustainability? So if we talk about density in very simple terms, as people per area, the dominant growth type that we see around the world is suburban sprawl. And that's the case not only in the United States, but certainly in Germany. And here we insert, just for orientation's sake, the scale of Germany in the context of the East Coast or thereabouts. Interestingly, Atlanta is featured there on the bottom left, Pittsburgh on the top right. The dark red and orange areas are essentially the suburban sprawl areas of Germany, so it covers a significant ground. And Berlin, you can see here in the eastern northern part of Germany. Crudely speaking, the density per square mile of the United States is 93 people per square mile. In Germany, it's 235. If we take that to the context of Atlanta, the metropolitan region, and Berlin, the metropolitan region for a start, what we see in the case of Berlin, we created this map that showed single-family housing around the core of Berlin. What you see as the figure ground, the black on white, is the denser part of Berlin, and everything that's pink is single-family housing. In the metro region, Metro Atlanta has an area of 8,376 square miles, and Berlin is a little bit bigger. The population is interestingly almost identical, and the densities are comparable. If you then go to the cities, Berlin as a city territory is significantly larger than Atlanta. The population is much larger, almost 8 times the size. And so you get a significant difference in density. The number of people per square miles is almost 3 times that of Atlanta. 11,000 people per square mile. If we go to well-known districts in Berlin and Atlanta, Buckhead is a well-known area and happens to be almost the same size as Prenzlauer Berg, of 4.7 to 4.23 square miles. The population is interesting. It's relatively high in Buckhead, but twice in Prenzlauer Berg. And so we have these different densities. As it happens, Prenzlauer Berg is one of the most popular districts in Berlin. It has the highest rate of newborn children. And so it's also one of the places where people want to be. We talk about sustainability. I'll just give you these figures. The tonnage of CO2 emissions per person per annum in Atlanta is 18.7. In Berlin, it's 4.7. And Berlin is pledged to go down by half. You can see the distance that Atlanta has to go to reach a comparable level. So this gives you a little bit about the background why suburban sprawl is not an option for the growth of the region. The design logic then says that we should follow 4 ecological principles for regional development and urban design. First one has already been, and 6 urban design concepts. The 4 ecological principles, first one has already been touched on by Paul in very clear terms. To emphasize the regional circular economy that involves energy, water, natural resources such as food, and some building material. The most important consequence for development is to say that no more surfaces are to be sealed in any new development, and that we must densify existing fabric. For example, here in the development of the 1950s in the eastern part of Berlin, where you can see potential for spaces in between. And to recenter mobility needs away from car-driven mobility to cyclists and pedestrians and other forms of public transport. The 6 urban design concepts that we were pursuing, how do we break down from this regional circular economy down to the urban level and architectural level? As Paul has indicated, Berlin is now pursuing officially most kinds of buildings using timber as a primary construction material in combination with reinforced concrete and steel. But to reduce the component of reinforced concrete and to even try multi-story high-rise buildings in timber. A few days ago, competition was adjudicated that has a 300-foot skyscraper in construction combined with reinforced concrete. So this is a kind of already an official agenda of the Senate of Berlin. We wanted to integrate the idea of improved regional mobility using public transport systems, revitalizing the ring system of railways and radial systems, and to improve the connectivity between the circular motorway that traverses or that surrounds Berlin with the network of trains, but also, as this diagram shows, to add significantly huge areas of new forests, both to the northeast as well as to the south. The south is essentially the impact that the new airport has on the neighborhoods, and so one of the developments of forests would deal with areas that wouldn't be desirable for any form of residence anyway. If we agreed to not increase the component of sealed surfaces, on the other hand, if we also were to strive to create new green areas, new parks, that means we would try to create new metropolitan parks inside the territory of Berlin, and also to review the use of allotment gardens that exists significantly in Berlin. It's about 7.7% of the total built area of Berlin consists of allotment gardens, and that we would advise government to convert those into buildings with urban farms. I'll show that in a case in a moment. 35% of Berlin is already sealed, and that should be the upper limit. We are also cognizant of the fact that we are going to have an increased number of intensive thunderstorms, and therefore stormwaters are going to be increasingly affect Berlin, as was the case 2 years ago when, on 2 occasions, floods basically filled the underground tunnels and rendered them useless for a few days. So instead of constructing canals and underwater tunnels, we would suggest that these water elements should be treated as amenities, as positively as in cities like Amsterdam. And in terms of the kind of ability for people who live and work in a large city, there should be the option of living and working in close proximity to one another. So functional mix is an important consideration, as is the continued upholding of the Berlin tradition of having social mixes. So we want to discourage the increased gentrification, the kind of pushing to the margins of socially weaker segments of the population to the periphery. So when we looked at Berlin, we created these series of analytical maps that showed where potential development areas were. And there are some industrial sites that can be revitalized, can be transformed. There are significant areas of social housing over the last 100 years that can be densified. There's a potential for another almost 1 million units in this red area. In the brown area, there is plenty of railway land in significant central locations, which can be developed. There are these allotment gardens that you see in this light green, that, as I mentioned, represents 7.2% of the total built-up area of Berlin. And then there are Protestant cemeteries, which are to be reused as public green. We want to recommend a different kind of use of public space, of the streets. And one of the key issues that we're proposing is to change the inner city motorway that runs from the north west around the south to the southeast. And we are proposing that the so-called Dog's Head should be turned into a single large, over 30-mile long boulevard. So the sunken motorway should be covered. That is a significant infrastructural project. In addition to that, the large, historically important arterial roads should be intensified and be upzoned to include taller buildings, and thereby changing the character of what are now sometimes somewhat provincial radial roads. And that, I think, you can see here in this aerial perspective quite well. This is the current inner city of Berlin. This is the Dog's Head here, that goes around the inner city of Berlin. This is the Tiergarten. That's the old city center with the government buildings in this area. This is the so-called Tempelhofer Feld. And that would be the intensification of the boulevard with different developments, also with radial accents going outwards. And the final point in this series of design concepts is the intensification of public transport systems, where we would complete the regional rail network as we've shown, and significantly put the regional S-Bahn on a 4-track series of viaducts. And that's shown in this diagram. The red and dark green shows the intensification of these viaducts and the kind of creation of the 4-track system so that you would have an express and local service. The ring motorway would be given a series of park and ride stations where the car traffic from Brandenburg would be able to change and then join the public transport system of the inner city of Berlin. So in summary, these are the different considerations and the impact that the strategic approaches of these 6 design concepts would have on Berlin. This is, I appreciate this is just a diagram, but let me give you a kind of basic framework. Our proposal has the capacity to increase the city's population by 1.5 to 2 million people. So we would go from 3.7 to 5.2 or 5.7 million people, and that would increase the density from currently 11,000 to around 15 or 16,000 people per square miles. I'm going to show you now 3 areas that we looked at in depth, and that will give you a further indication of our design approach. The first one is a city or a town to the south of Berlin. This is the Berlin proper, and this is Ludwigsfelde, which has been traditionally a location for heavy industry, for car manufacturers and train manufacturers, but has recently, in the last few decades, become a logistical center also for raw material and for recycling of waste. So it's not exactly only at the kind of upper level of the industry. Then we have an area to the east, which was at the turn of the previous century, around 1900, a center for industry, and that's gone through a series of up and downs in fortunes. And then a notorious node in the west, where motorways and large-scale facilities come together and meet the normal urban fabric. The Ludwigsfelde is this assembly of residential areas with large-scale industrial and recycling facilities, and is crisscrossed by a motorway, a railway cutting, and interstate highway. Our proposal was to say that we have to deal with some of these elements that cut the city into different components, We have to improve the connectivity, something that John is going to go into. We have to create and give the city a new identity by providing a large central park that stretches from the east. And we want to provide them with a sense of future development that doesn't erase the landscape identity of it, on the contrary, but that concentrates the development. So this is the proposal for Ludwigsfelde. It's one that has caught the imagination of the mayor, and Barbara, who has made a presentation with the mayor last week, was able to convince the mayor that this was a proposal worth discussing with the local population and the planning people there. So we will look forward to kind of a detailed exploration there. But let me just point out, we recommended that the railway cutting should be covered so that the east-west connections would be possible, and a number of other things which I won't go into, but we won't shy away from large infrastructural investments. So that's the final image. For the second site in the east, it's directly related to the Spree, and is also suffering from a series of island conditions, which we were interested in improving by creating a new network, and also by addressing a deficit in landscape along the river. There is an existing park which we're not changing. But the allotment gardens that you see here, this is a kind of Berlin favelas. We are recommending that there should be peripheral development of 2.5 stories height with urban farming on the inside, and a high density development along this artery, which is one of the typological proposals we have for Berlin as a whole. So these are the summary views of the three-dimensional proposal. So you see a range of differently scaled high-rise buildings with the traditional Berlin perimeter block. You see here the perimeter development with the urban farming. And this is a view along the major artery as it is now, and our proposal for the densification of this. And finally, with West View, which is in the west, we have the Avos motorway from the 1920s meet the inner city motorway here, with the exhibition grounds there and with the traditional 19th century fabric. So you can see something familiar to you all, and a huge infrastructural node with railway lines here, motorways, and motorways here. And our attempt to clean this, so to speak, by covering the motorway cuttings with a boulevard, and by introducing a new interlocking series of parks into one large lake-based park that connects to this one here. And from this diagram, you can see that essentially we are proposing construction in areas that otherwise aren't infrastructural areas or underused railway land. On the western side, we are intensifying the villa structure and building higher buildings along this arterial road. And so here are a series of final perspective studies. You see the motorway system here with the spaghetti junction. And all of that either goes into tunnel or it is domesticated into normal urban streets. And a park is now allowed to connect to the south. A detailed view around the conference center here, which gives you a view of the different levels of infrastructure. That would all be covered up and transformed into this boulevard that goes around the entire inner city of Berlin. And the final perspective overlay shows you the enormous work that this would represent and this enormous investment that, of course, would lie ahead if it were ever to be decided. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wilf. Okay, I'm cognizant of time, and Paul, Wilf, and I are very interested in a lively conversation afterwards. So people interested in joining that conversation, please ask Carmen to upgrade you to presenters so that we can see you and hear you. And I'll get on with my topic as fast as I'm able. What I'd really like to discuss first, I'd like to discuss 4 questions essentially. The first is, what exactly did the Space Syntax group at Georgia Tech, Texas Austin, and very importantly, the Chalmers Institute of University of Technology contribute to all this? And as you would expect, given that Space Syntax is a socially motivated approach to urban design and urban analysis, we were mostly interested in the quality of urban life that the master plan would enhance. And so in precise terms, we tested the effect of the perimeter boulevard that Hoyden and Wang are proposing. And then we helped figure out the preferable and optimal street alignments and connections for the 3 development sites. And then we tested the effects of the proposed street networks regarding the accessibility that people will have to significant facilities or green areas. And our aim at Wilfried's request was to bridge between design intention and iterative design development on the one hand, but as I mentioned at the beginning, to also demonstrate, working with Hoyden and Wang, how the public discussion and debate about urban design can be informed and supported by objective measures and indices. And so when it came to the question of the boulevard, what you see here is a Space Syntax centrality map. And what we mean by centrality in this case is the streets that most contribute to keeping the city coherent as a whole, the streets that are most legible to the inhabitants and most likely to be used for trips. And you can see that the present structure emphasizes some essentially radial lines and only a small part of peripherals, whereas the proposed boulevard would actually have 2 significant effects. It would create a pretty significant ring road with a good contribution to overall connectivity, and it would add new radials that come into play as major connectors. So in a nutshell, it will go from a tighter to a more distributed distribution of centrality, which is a very desirable thing to have if you want to make the city as a whole more functional and more lively. And we then looked at the individual areas. This is Westview that Wilfried ended with. And as Wilfried showed, we sort of worked together to create the new street layout that will replace the existing. We did that in a way that allows for the continuity of new parks, so that there is more frontage onto those parks. And we then work to distribute the density. And if I may call it, the classic space syntax analysis was all about making sure that we recognize what are the best flows that will run into the new development coming from the surroundings. Because obviously in every urban design effort, it is of vital importance to ensure that the new development improves everything around it rather than act as an isolated enclave. So we did street layout analysis to pick up and intensify as much as possible the flows coming in. But then we did, and this is where the contribution of the Chalmers University of Technology was more significant. We studied the new distribution of development density, shown in red, the new kinds of accessibility to significant amenities like projected schools or other facilities of relevance, and the new accessibility to green areas. And so basically, as you see more intense red or more intense blue or more intense green, you're essentially looking at increases in accessible density of different kinds. Generic accessible density to urban development, accessibility to particular facilities of interest, and accessibility to green areas. And this was repeated over the three sites, and I don't need to spend time going over each one of them. I think you get the gist of it. Now, everybody at Georgia Tech, I guess, has some idea about what space syntax is, but I'd like to briefly summarize it for those that are not familiar. It's essentially descriptive theory of the affordances of inhabited space that impact human function, to put it very simply. But when it comes to cities, which is the particular issue that we're dealing with today, the difficulty is to take these very complex objects that we create and sort of understand how to measure their evident functionality. The extraordinary thing about cities is that they grow piecemeal over time, sometimes without a plan, sometimes with retrospective plans enforced, and they are still very intelligible and very functional. And our typical theories about cities stay intuitive, or if they do propose quantification, they propose quantification at pretty simple levels, like the number of blocks per area, which is a good indicator of the grain of the urban fabric, but not very discriminating, for example, about the type of street system, whether it is a regular grid or an organic, irregular one. And as a consequence of not having particularly powerful descriptive tools, our theoretical intuitions remain diagrammatic. And the problem with that is that it's very difficult to check how they translate into design decisions. And so the primary focus of space syntax is to understand how cities foster contact of different kinds: social contact, economic contact and exchange, intellectual contact and exchange, and cultural contact. It is the ability of cities to foster contact that underpins their ability to promote social and economic and cultural prosperity. And the street network is the long-term framework that makes contact possible. So that's what we're looking at. And as part of that, we are interested in this analysis of centrality patterns. But when one thinks about centrality, it's very important to think what measure we use. And so typically we use metric distance, which is of course linked to physical effort. But the way that cities become intelligible has to do with the way they handle something we might call very simply perceptual distance. How far down the road can I see? How many turns do I need to take to go wherever it is that I'm going? And it is this cognitive distance that actually affects social function even more than metric distance. And it can be measured in a number of ways, by the angle turns of a path, or by the number of vistas you need to change as you move. And that's the kind of thing that space syntax brings to the table. And this is a slide of 6 major cities at the turn of the 1830s, really. And you can see the variety of centrality patterns that emerge. And you can see the obvious contrast between Istanbul, which is an introverted city if you judge it by its street layout, versus London, the center of the Industrial Revolution and economic growth, which actually has central streets traversing it east, west, and north, south in all directions, versus, let's say, Berlin, where the key axes of centrality essentially correspond exactly to the phases of historic development, versus Paris, where before Haussmann, there's practically no major thoroughfare that enters the medieval hub, that kind of remains isolated, and so on and so forth. So it is these patterns of centrality that space syntax is good at capturing. And the other thing that we can understand is which is fundamental to cities, is the relationship between local areas and their identity as spatial systems and the city as a whole. And these are simple correlation diagrams that I believe are intuitive to even people who don't understand statistical analysis. And you can see that in some cities, like for example, Berlin or Philadelphia, the local centers and the global centers are very tightly linked, so that your sense of your immediate surroundings gives you a good sense of where you are in the city as a whole, versus the more labyrinthine cities like Venice that we all love, or Istanbul, where the relation of local and global centrality is practically not there at all. And so, again, this is another aspect that is fundamental to what space syntax brings to the table, the ability to have different models and work deliberately towards the appropriate kind of local parts and global wholes. Now, the other thing that we do recently, thanks to the pioneering work of Lars Marcus and Meta Berghauser-Pont at Chalmers, is that we can incorporate density into the analysis of access and connectivity. Now, density is a very tricky concept in urban planning. And we usually use very aggregate measures of density, like people or employment or build space per square mile or something. And these are very good high-level indicators of what is going on, but they have no descriptive power if we want to understand how things function. So for those of us that live in Atlanta, Buckhead has a very high density of development of offices at its center, but it's not all very accessible. It is quite a trick to move from the blocks inside the Buckhead loop, let's say, to Lenox Square. Whereas Midtown has comparable kinds of density, which is very easily accessible from everywhere. So the significant issue is how to measure density as accessible density. And what one can do is one can begin to link properties to streets, and as a first step, talk about the potentiality represented by properties. The number of properties and their frontages and their shapes is obviously a driver of what development can occur. And so this is an example from the work at Chalmers, comparing the distribution of different kinds of properties over the city. But then we can add the actual morphologies of built space. And what Meta Berghauser-Pont has done so well is to create this multidimensional description of morphology, where we essentially play FAR, plot ratio, and open space. And we can sort of describe different characteristics, patterns of development in quantitative terms, and then see how those are distributed over different cities and establish benchmarks. And finally, we can, in a much more complicated fashion, but very simple conceptually, we can actually relate type of streets to type of development density. So, for example, are the freestanding pavilion-type housing estates associated with secluded streets and socially neglected areas, or are they found more in streets that are essential to the vitality of the city? So these are the things that Space Index brings to the table in principle. The significant question, since we are talking here about a practice university collaboration, is what makes anything like Space Index credible. It's not sufficient to have precise and transparent descriptions. One needs to question what's the knowledge base that convinces us that these descriptions have any value. Now, it's a question that resonates with me. I remember that when I was at the Bartlett as a student, this was the tail end of what at the time seemed like a significant debate. On the one hand, Doxiadis had finished Islamabad in '68, and this was his attempt to bring modernism back into Hippodamian-type planning principles, to create essentially grids that would embed neighborhoods in slightly larger areas, and those larger areas into the city as a whole. He was still obsessed by notions of hierarchy that we don't think describe cities well, and he was still obsessed to offset the grids in order to distinguish one neighborhood from the next. But at least he was countering very deliberately the kind of modernist planning that we associate with Siam, as represented, for example, by Chandigarh, which is underpinned by this separation of neighborhoods through a denser packing of high-speed roads, and then fragmentation inside the sectors by creating cluster developments rather than continuous streets. Nevertheless, his friend, Llewellyn Davis, was advocating, influenced by Melvin Weber, was advocating a new kind of city where space would not matter, where what's next to you would not count, because everybody would be so wonderfully mobile, and everybody would access any facility anywhere. And I'm, of course, referring to Milton Keynes, the last major new town in Britain, which was being studied and developed about the same time. And this simply serves to underscore that in academia and in practice, we often have very different normative principles, and it's often quite hard to assess what will work, maybe with energy efficient cars, or maybe other means of transportation. Milton Keynes, which is now abhorrent to most of us because it's so energy demanding, might become desirable again. So the underlying question is, what kind of knowledge can we build that goes beyond normative preferences? And in a nutshell, what space syntax research has shown in the last 30 years or so are essentially three things. First, that the layout of streets drives not the amount of people on the street, that is partly a function of development density, but the distribution. So whether you'll get sharp transitions from lively areas to very quiet areas or dead areas, or whether you'll have a modulation of liveliness and encounter, is very much a function of the street grid, not of development density. That's what we call the principle of natural movement, because it almost happens across cultures and across cities, almost like a law of nature. The second thing that we've learned is the way in which land uses that are dependent on the passing trade, that are dependent on the volume of contact, essentially, are not only distributed according to distance from center, as classical central place theory would suggest, so that the further away you go from center, the less the commerce, but they're also distributed according to proximity to the most central streets. The closer you are to a main street, even if it is far away from the so-called center, the CBD, the more commerce you're likely to attract. And this has been intuitively known very well since the 30s, especially in America, the distinction between strip developments versus hub developments. But it has been tested time and again, including cities like Buenos Aires that almost seem to belong to the textbook case of a single CBD city. And then the third thing that we learned is that those same relationships that drive the distribution of movement and the distribution of land use to a large extent, are also the ones that affect the way people understand the environment. So whether you talk about cognitive mapping or about the cognitive structure that people have of cities, you get back to those same variables of syntactic connectivity and centrality. So what this amounts to is the idea that the functionality and intelligibility of cities are subject to fundamental laws, if you want to call them that, and it is those objective constraints that then influence the way in which, as cultures, we invest in cities. And so on the side of intelligibility, I would place issues of interest like connectivity and differentiation, and very importantly, the interface of scales that Wilf has actually addressed so well. And on the side of functionality, I would, of course, place questions like the distribution of land uses and how you distribute attraction over urban space to make it all more vital. And then, of course, under culture, I would place such more sensitive things like the economies of access, privileged and unprivileged people, food deserts versus well-supplied areas, social interfaces, whether we help people across incomes or cultures mix or not, and of course situational codes, by which I mean lifestyles and ways in which we sort of embrace the city as citizens. And it is this kind of understanding of the interaction between objective constraint and social choice that an approach like space syntax brings to what essentially needs to be a socio-technical systems understanding of the city as a whole, which loops back to how Paul started us all by asking us to think about cities as essentially socio-technical systems. The last question I would like to address, and I'm almost done, I promise, is a question that might seem difficult, but I want to acknowledge it. I want to essentially ask, are we progressing? And I want to answer that in terms of research, we are progressing. We have a much more solid understanding of how things work. In terms of design, we seem to be, in a way, on a steady track. This is the first space index involvement in London in 1987, working with Norman Foster. And the themes were very similar to the ones we have been dealing with in Berlin. How to link a new development to the surrounding area, how to make a park both a feature that enhances adjoining properties and an amenity for people living all around, how to link major infrastructure. Back then it was fantasized that the under-channel connection from Europe would terminate in King's Cross and Pancras in a new terminal, how to link major infrastructure to the new first-grade offices and the new residential neighborhoods. These are all familiar questions and familiar approaches. And one thing that obviously we would all want to see more is not only the extension of this trend, which is deeply rooted in the last 30 years, the rediscovery of the connected city as a value, but what we'd like to see more perhaps is what Norman Foster stated so well in 97 when he addressed the first Space Index Symposium, 12 symposia back, when he actually said that we have to create those dialogues between the world of science and observation and research and the world of intuition and value and hunch. And it seems to me that if we were able to more often have those three-way collaborations between university-based studios that can be more speculative and university-based research that maybe addresses foundations, and then forward-looking practice that tries to really come to terms with the problems of the day rather than find the easiest slogan to get the next job, then I think we would be making progress much, much faster. And with that, I will stop sharing and we enter the conversation. Carmen, I don't know if you could reactivate everyone's screen. And I would like to ask Susan Chin, who has joined us, if she would like to maybe try to start the conversation. I would like to introduce Susan. She's, of course, a fellow of the AIA. She's a principal of Design Connects, based in New York. She has led the Design Trust for Public Space in New York, a major nonprofit organization that has influenced the public realm in New York since '95. And she has been an assistant commissioner for capital projects for the New York Department of Cultural Affairs. And I'm really delighted that she's with us today.
Thanks so much, John. Wow, I feel like my brain's going to explode. You talk about connecting space syntax and connecting science and instinct. I feel like we should really delve into that more. But it's really great to reconnect with Wilfried and the team, with Barbara Hoyden, to see Berlin through a different lens. I had seen Berlin when the government was bringing the central government back from Bonn to Berlin, and then through its public spaces with Wilfried's and Barbara's initiative of Metropolis and the Academy der Künste, and then now to think about Berlin-Brandenburg in 2070. What you've laid out is a really comprehensive look, and it makes me relate back to New York City, where I am, and thinking about, we were going to have 1 million more New Yorkers. And so thinking about an expanding city for 1.5 million and 2 million more Berliner Brandenburgers. How do you do this in an ecological way, as well as thinking about the challenging times we are with thinking about health and COVID and hyperlocal, where everyone is now homebound or close to homebound, live work. The young people, the millennials, the emerging professionals have always been talking about live work balance, and we're all living it now. So, in terms of going back to the plan and the circular economy, there seems a lot of circles in this plan, which is based on the concentric circles of the ring roads and the radials. And so the framework of the plan, seems a lot about mobility and throughput. And, something that is so memorable to me about the character of Berlin draws on its essential nature, that you feel like you're not in a very dense city. Wilfried, I was really surprised to see your statistics. And so how do you see the new character of the Ring Boulevard? Are you drawing that on the character of the nature and the art and the culture and some of these things that are community and human scale that are so essential about Mitte? And how are you incorporating those things into the Ring Boulevard? Is it a totally new character, or is it that you are really finding the essence and embedding it there? And I guess before I leave you to answer, and Paul, I was really fascinated by the Northwest, the regions you're talking about, social, and I guess it's generated from Wilfried, but the Northwest and the Southeast. Oh, I have my hands wrong for you. But thinking about social justice and how this ring and radial development is helping those underserved areas. And is it through forestry and the new economy, or is there something that's a hyper generator or accelerator within the Ring Boulevard and within the growth boundary that is helping these underserved regions?
Paul, do you want to begin?
Yeah, I can't help but thinking. I mean, it was interesting what John said. There's this instinct versus science, and I think a lot of the work we did, I think, was based on instinct. And I can't help but think a balanced regional economy, in whatever circular or radial approach, is slightly more democratic. Therefore, it's actually supporting all segments of society, and it's just bringing a more balanced accessibility of whatever services infrastructure. I think that just allows the city. It's not gravitating or over dependent upon any part of the city. The city is just more in balance, and driving a future agenda which is not based on, if you take mobility, not based on individual ownership and space consuming infrastructure. Frankly, I think what you did, Wilfried, you decarded a little bit, but you've created more space for other stuff. Therefore, it's a more harmonious, more balanced, more accessible city for everybody. I don't know if that answers your question, Susan, but Wilfried, I don't know if you want to pick up that.
Yeah, I think that's hitting the nail on the head. We're in Berlin cognizant that there's less water, less rain coming, and that rain that is coming is more torrential, and the high degree of sealed surfaces means that the water can't, disappear quickly enough, or it just floods. So we have to capture it. And there's a policy reversal. Rather than to drain the water away from Berlin, there's a decision to keep as much water as possible in Berlin, because the River Spree has been going backward last year. The trees in the existing forests are over half are suffering. Branches are falling off because they're too dry. Barks are dropping off. There's the wrong type of tree for the climate that we're going to have. So there's going to be a massive new effort in diversifying the population of trees. Anyway, we have the urban heat sink problem. So if you overlay all these issues and then say, well, but there are more people coming, so where do you build? And if you decide we're not going to build in the suburbs, then where do you build in the city? And if you just listen to the NIMBYs and they say, oh no, we don't want any more density here, and then of course then you're going to be stuck. So our decision was to analyze where can you actually develop, and if we're going to say we're going to develop on railway land, we're going to develop on motorway land that is barren by hundreds of feet on either side, and we're going to build tall, because if you build on a certain level, of course you're going to still have a density, but you're not going to have that density that you potentially might need. Our suggestions, of course, are serving suggestions, right? If people want to build less density, that's okay. But what we've said is, let's urbanize, let's domesticate the motorway and create an urban element that is a 240-foot wide boulevard with very large pedestrian segments, vehicular elements in the middle, local traffic on the sides, cycling paths, facilities for social and commercial, like cafes, etc. So that is a performance space, if you like, which is dedicated not simply for cars and lorries, but for pedestrians, cyclists, and so on. And it becomes a leveling element that creates a new identity. And I think John's research shows that very well, that what John talked about in terms of the local global cognitive moment, right, with the statistical distribution of how you sense where you are in certain kinds of cities, the effect of the Ring Boulevard is to increase, is a jump in scale in the kind of cognitive understanding of a city from the inner city of the 19th century to the inner city of the 20th century. And that is what we're defining. And then the radials are, in a way, the radials of the 21st century. So we're
I guess, Wilfried, how would you prioritize? How would you prioritize where, what are the strongest nodes or where you begin to differentiate? I mean, John, you talk about, the street network, making it very efficient and mentally, my mental mapping, the street network, I can understand through this Ring Boulevard. But then where do I begin to differentiate?
I'd like to allow others to come into the discussion, but very briefly,
Sure.
My sense is that here, Hoyden and Wang were trying to illustrate how the 6 principles could be applied in a variety of cases. And so the choice of the 3 examples was quite strategic. One example where you have the Westview, infrastructure acting as a divider, as in many cities around the world. How can you handle that condition? Another situation where you have a major route, which is used by many, surrounded by essentially underused space for a variety of reasons. So essentially taking advantage of potentiality. And then the third example where you have almost a satellite condition, and you're asking, how can I, it's already there, how can I give it new meaning and new vitality? Now, to me, the issue of priorities would depend on the real politics of the situation. What a master plan can do is demonstrate how you handle, how you apply the 6 principles to a significant variety of real cases. Then let the politics take over, I would argue, and that will decide if we start here or there. I mean, we planners cannot dictate social and political process. We can only inspire aims.
Yeah, but I think, John, what was interesting, and you indicated that a little bit, there was a mutual back and forth between yourselves and ourselves regarding the precise alignment of streets, because that would improve the connectivity at a local level. And because we are working at such a ridiculous scale of the entire city, right? The next phase of research and design would be to look at the impact of the basic strategy and how you actually resolve each node, as Susan points out, at a more refined scale.
But I wonder if David Green or Paul Matelik or Ellen Dunham Jones or Sung Hong Kim, there are a number of people here whose experience with cities is quite strong. Any comments, any questions?
Hey, John, it's Dave. It's great to see you. Great to see everyone. I just want to ask 2 really quick questions, very specific questions. I also have to say, John, I really miss listening to you speak. One of the big things I miss about living in Atlanta. So firstly, back to something Paul said, and I would ask for all of you to see if there's a way that you can think through this, but when you referenced informal settlements, unplanned settlements, something that, John, you look at through a sort of spatial analysis, and Paul, you were talking about from a cultural perspective. But is it possible, and if it is possible, how do we actually allow for those things to come back into existence? Because they were built through history, but we don't see that happen in a formal way, even a legally recognized way today. And then the second thing is tied back to the cognitive mapping. This is becoming a really critical issue in a lot of work that we and others are doing. And what do you all see as the indicators that start to build the level of investigation that we see in spatial mapping, in cognitive mapping, in the planning processes?
Paul, would you like to talk about the informal settlements in Saudi Arabia?
I mean, the interesting thing is, I don't think it was scrape it away and start again. It's interesting, some of the problems, I would say there were 2 key problems in some of these areas. those informal settlements attract some of the environmental challenges, whether it's flooding, pollution, etc. Therefore, fairly modest financial investments to start dealing with some of those measures, flood mitigation, etc., dealing with pollution, creating significant enhancement. And the other measure, I think, was redirecting fairly modest sums of money, but into community and public space projects, and creating a level of participation and greater sense of appreciation for the environment in which people are living. And so, but it certainly wasn't, to scrape it away and start again, which is quite interesting in a country that could probably afford to do that. And actually, it's easier to try and, take the problem off the component of the city. So I would say that's how they were dealt with, to be honest.
I have a quick comment to add on that issue. I have some limited experience in Saudi Arabia, and it seems that there is a government preference for demolishing and rebuilding that I'm not very qualified to comment on. But in the case of Jeddah in particular, there was a master plan that involved the Space Syntax team out of London, Space Syntax Limited. And what they found useful is that even informal settlements organically grow sort of a structure of primary streets. And so what they did in practical terms is to prioritize where do you start if you wanted to upgrade without demolition. And that was actually a very useful process to suggest that you may start from those key streets and maybe straighten them or make the infrastructure better along them and gradually upgrade the whole system. So that's just a relatively minor comment, just for the sake of adding. David,
John,
I'm not. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I was just picking up on some of your comments, and so many, about the change in focusing on Saudi. I mean, I've been dealing with that for the last 10 years or so, and a lot of the buildings there and a lot of the street networks and roadways are really not, really. There's not a lot of history other than except some of the areas maybe where you've been dealing with in Medina, Mecca, Jeddah. But a lot of my focus has been in Medina and Riyadh, and a little bit in the eastern province as well. But I've found that, to just get people there to finally start to understand the importance of community place is really starting to change. And the idea of day and night city centers and places that can be built there. But I was listening to you guys talk a little bit about what your developments and found it very interesting because we're with myself and the firm I'm with, we're working at a variety of scales, both small lifestyle infill to try to work within areas, but then also these, cities from like Okaz, we're going to talk a little bit about with, it's a brand new city, right? 10 million square meters, what are going to be the governors? So it's interesting to think about the form you guys have been, the syntax and the elements you've been developing, but it's then also how do you help to take some of those goals when you're working on the scale? I mean, we're not working at the scale of NEOM, maybe with some of the scales that Paul has worked on, but to deal with new cities versus infill cities in some of these environments, like Saudi Arabia, for instance, or in Kuwait, some of the others. It'd be interesting to see how, talk a little bit about how some of the plans or the syntax and the goals that how could apply to maybe ideas of expansion and contraction and, what are the governors? And so often,
Well, I deliberately didn't talk about the NEOM type projects in this, because I thought it was more interesting to talk about the projects I did. I would overlay heritage onto the other two issues that I mentioned. So the environmental interventions, quality public space, and then enhancement of what may appear as modest scale heritage opportunities, but valuing what you've got and enhancing around that in terms of creating a sense of public pride. I mean, coming back, John, to your Jeddah example, something like 50% of Jeddah was, low-income migrant population. 50%, slum population, frankly, in one of the most developed, cities in the world. And their biggest problem was flooding. Twice a year, that population was completely washed out through flooding. And so just dealing with flooding created a platform that you could then start in terms of urban intervention to enhance quality public space. But there was no point investing in that if you couldn't control the environmental issues.
But I wouldn't want us to move too far away from Berlin. But one
exactly, yeah.
Thing to get your sense, Paul. We are advocating density in the knowledge that, at least in the case of Berlin, density is good all around. It's good for transportation, it's good for accommodating population, it's good for environment and the circular economy. And I've been asking myself, would we make the same argument in the context of a very different climate? And recently, a common friend that Wilf and I have, Ricky Burdett, was actually pointing to some examples that suggest yes, because of the ability to provide shade and the ability to reduce the costs of cooling. Is that something that resonates with you? The notion that even in places like Saudi Arabia, an increase in density might actually be desirable from an energy and environment point of view.
Yeah, I think that could be, that is quite interesting. I mean, trying to bring the conversation back to Berlin a little bit, perhaps. I was also surprised at the facts of Wilfried. In the relative density facts of Berlin. You contradicted my intro, actually, Wilfried, in some respects. What's interesting about that is the perception is that it's not a very dense place. So how do you create the density without it being a dense place? And that gets you thinking in terms of how do you educate the citizens or make them aware, citizens of a city, what actually good density might look like and feel like, that they buy into it. Because I'm not sure the politicians will deliver this, but the entrepreneurs. I think those economic cycles that I was describing, they're not going to be financed, I don't think, necessarily by the public sector. So how do you encourage the private sector and the entrepreneurs and the citizens of a city to invest into a project that actually has got some long-term value? Because again, instinctively, Berlin for me is not a dense city.
No, it isn't. It has, as we know, only a density of 11,000 per square mile, but it's 39,000 in Prenzlauer Berg. And it's equally high in Friedenau, which is in Wilmersdorf. So there are areas where there are incredible densities. They don't look dense at all, but we all know that perimeter building, 4 or 5 stories development with courtyard types can create very dense populations. And so that's one topic. But to give maybe Paul Matelic an answer to his question, how do you plan a new city? If you presume that the lifestyle that people who are going to be living in that city is going to be an automotive consumerist lifestyle, you will design the city of the 20th century. If you think that that's going to be different, you will design a different city. And if you begin to think about the changing nature of consumption and of mobility, of live work, you are into a different type of infrastructure. So, I mean, I think that's a general term, and I think our proposal does not speak of uses. It does not speak of typologies of units on the inside. It talks about densities and offers conceptually the same kind of flexibility that we have in the existing speculative development types that we have in Berlin of the 19th century, where it can be residential, it can be mixed. There's no specification. And that is the wonderful thing about, these robust building types that are incredibly flexible in terms of their subdividability and so on. So we're very cognizant and we are thinking in terms of a master plan, not of an architectural proposal, but one that incorporates certain kinds of high-rise developments that don't have the high-rise right on the street, but are set inside the block, so that the effect on shadows and so on is reduced. Anyway, those are the kinds of considerations. I mean, we can go on further, but we should listen to other questions.
Yeah, let's open it up to others.
Do you see me, John? Do you see me?
No, not yet. Can you please turn on your camera? Song Hong Kim is a professor in the university in Seoul, and he and Wilfried and I have intersected paths a number of times, including.
Do you see me? Do you see me?
See you now, Song. Go ahead. What time is it for you? 5 o'clock in the morning, or?
It's 7:40 in the morning.
My God. Thank you for being with us.
It's wonderful, inspiring presentation and graphics and maps. It seems to me the key argument you brought today is the idea of densification and sustainability. I think that's the difference between 1987 Space Syntax involvement with design in the London and the Berlin project, because at that time, I do not recall that Space Syntax does not deal with the sustainability at that time. So I think this is new development for Space Syntax research. And I live in very dense cities. In Seoul, the land size of Seoul is only 3% of metropolitan Atlanta, but the population is twice. So the density is 68 times density of metro Atlanta. And we have a very strong voice densification, at the same time decentralization, but we do not deal with the densification and sustainability at the same time. I think it's the key things to me today. But today, Wilfried brought a very new idea about the surface ceiling, and you said that Berlin, 35% of the Berlin is already sealed. In Korea, in Seoul, once the new development started, the surface sealed almost 90% because the surface car parking, because car has to move underground building. So densification and sustainability issues in terms of this ceiling, I think this is something very challenging issues in Seoul and Korea. So how do we densify? It's really the design question. It's not only just the planning questions. So that's the things that I just learned today, how to densify and how to deal with this surface car parking and surface ceiling, things like that.
Thank you, Song.
Thank you, Song. Berlin, as you know, is in the old part of Berlin is in what is kind of a very shallow valley. It's very shallow. But it's that shallow valley that has the highest degree of sealed surface. So if you think when it rains, it's like this drainage channel. And when it rains a lot, it just floods right in the lowest part. And so that's one of the key issues. Over the last decades, it's just basically sealed and sealed. And so when we had these rainstorms, we had two sets of 3 days when the underground was basically paralyzed. So, those are the kinds of things we have to deal with.
I think
it's 10 to 6, and I'm sure that people are beginning to grow tired. Paul, please.
No, I think we left some work out there, Wilfried, which is good because we've got some more to do. I'd never it was only when I was preparing for this, I was talking to some colleagues around that S-curve and what is the typology of urban landscape that suits the infrastructure need, and that varies across the city. And it would be good to continue our work to try and plot that into the 3 developments we've looked at in Berlin and other parts of Berlin. To see if there is a more, proven theoretical density that would really work in the future in terms of, the provision of other services, particularly taken, a post-COVID world where, we're going to be working and living and schooling and shopping and playing in more, localized communities, I would have thought, yeah. And, I think we're always learning, and there's definitely lots more we still need to do. In this discussion. And,
that's why I think Tilman Latz, who was the landscape architect on this competition, urged us to create these large parks. So if on the one hand you have concentrated development around these radials with high rises, but you at the same time immediately adjacent, a few hundred yards on either side, you have amenities, green spaces, urban farming and so on. That, I think, is the right kind of balance, both in terms of unsealed surfaces, in terms of green facilities, in terms of leisure facilities, etc., that give people the variety of green areas that they will in future need. Because I think urban farming is certainly a growth area.
Any other comments? We're getting near 6 o'clock when I think we have to thank our Wilfried and Paul for their wonderful presentations. Any other comments from or questions or at this stage, I guess, comments more likely.
Can I just change continents?
Yes.
From South America, Brasilia. I was just wondering about the relations between the proposal that you made and the planning ideology. Why do I ask this? Because in Brazil, it's absolutely impossible for academia to talk with planning officials of the government. And on the other hand, the relations between the proposals you made and social culture. For example, you were talking about urban farming. Is it really a trend? I mean, is it going on? Are you optimistic about the acceptance of these proposals?
Well, we didn't get a prize, so that's one clear answer. However, we have begun talking to politicians, and that I think is very exciting, and there is interest. So let's see what happens over the next few weeks and months. There's an election coming up, but urban farming is a growth area. It's a huge trend in Berlin. There's a clamor for the areas in former airfield of Tempelhofer Feld. There's a certain area earmarked for urban farming. There are these pocket parks all over in the inner city. There is there's a shift in the German population and in the Berlin population away from eating meat to becoming more vegetarian. So there's a huge undercurrent of change. People are the car ownership per 100 households is 46. 46 households in Berlin have a car, right? If you put all these figures together, 16% of people or more in the last year, 20% of people were cycling. All those kinds of numbers are very encouraging that the population is actually ahead of what the politicians are thinking of.
By the way, Fred is a professor at the University of Brasilia, and maybe the most knowledgeable person I know about Brasilia itself. So,
thank you, John.
No, but I'm saying this, Fred, to ask you what motivates you, because I would imagine that the type of approach that Paul and Wilf have been describing would be applicable, no? Not in the pilot plan, obviously, but in the metropolitan area.
I mean, it's such a different culture. For example, you're talking about now car ownership. 70% of households in Brazil have a car, and in the poorest region, in the poorest borough, we have 40% of households having a car. I mean, it's such a huge distance. I mean, I'm so envious of the environment you're working with, because really we have a lot to go ahead, really.
Well, I didn't show you one analytical map that we did covering the public transport network, and we just basically drew all the lines with a 5-minute catchment area of walking. And essentially, you cover the entire area of Berlin, with the exception of the forests and the lakes, right? With these 5-minute walking rings, and it's part of this mentality of a city that is distinct from any other city in Germany, where the component of the dense residential part or dense normal urban part is significantly higher in relation to the overall size of the city than in any other German city. So in any other German city, the component of the inner city, the dense inner city, to the rest is significantly less, and you have that much more suburbia, and therefore the car ownership rate is higher.
Real quick one, John. This urban farming theme. We were involved in a project. It didn't develop, but it was with an organisation that was looking at the provision of cress and growing cress, which the day that the seed opens up, if you took one element of that seed and you take that every morning, your vaccination against diabetes was much higher. So you had a pharmaceutical company working with the health insurance companies, working with Metro, which is a large-scale food retailer in Berlin, Germany, working together, producing, I don't want to say genetically modified or superfoods, but you have a cross-sector, less meat, as Wilfried said, approach to public awareness of what represents a future better lifestyle, frankly, yeah, and the savings simply from healthcare costs, lower diabetes challenges were so significant, so I think there will be these themes, and they will start connecting those economic circles, those cross-sector economic circles. I don't think we can foresee them at the moment, but I think 20 years down the road, it'd be absolutely fascinating how these continuums have created new circular economies. I'm waffling a bit there, but it was absolutely fascinating.
I think it's a good place to go, Paul, because actually you're right. There will be, if any of the arguments that you have been presenting today with Wilf holds water, and I think they do, we will see exactly what you say, the self-reinforcing circles of economy and changing ways of thinking that will prompt those changes. I would like to really thank you enormously for being with us at Georgia Tech. Tonight, I want to say for you, it's now 12 o'clock in Berlin, midnight. It's been a wonderful afternoon for us here. And I'm very grateful for helping organize this discussion. And I'm very grateful for all the people that joined from so many different places. I'm sorry we didn't have more conversation, but I'm sure that many people recognize that the themes we've advanced today resonate so well with themes that Ellen Dunham Jones has been advocating at Georgia Tech for a long time. So there was that resonance also. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, John. Fantastic. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Night.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.